In the winter of 1844, the slave market at the edge of New Orleans smelled of molasses, sweat, and something sour that stuck to the back of the throat like guilt. Men in expensive coats and beaver fur hats moved through the crowd with the relaxed confidence of those who believed the world belonged to them by birthright. Auctioneers called out numbers and names. The rhythm of buying and selling lives blended with the gulls' cries and the distant grinding of riverboats. Into that world of shouting and chains walked a young woman in widow's black with a veil over her face and a velvet purse clutched tight in one gloved hand. Maribel Ashford's steps were careful, deliberate. Every plank of the market's raised platform felt like a stage she had no wish to be seen upon. Yet there she was, the virgin widow of Ashford Reach, the one people whispered about in parlors and churches, the woman whose husband had died without giving her a child, without even, so rumors said, ever laying a proper hand upon her. A strange, cold union, people murmured, a marriage never consummated. She felt their eyes even before she heard anyone speak. Is that a woman? A voice hissed behind a lace parasol. It can't be. Not here. Not her. Who else drapes herself in black like that in her 20s? The auction yard operator, a man named Harlan Cost, spotted her as she approached the block. His face rearranged itself into something like confusion, wearing the mask of courtesy. Mrs. Ashford. He dipped his head, more wary than respectful. Didn't expect to see you in a place like this. If you're looking for house help, I can have the girls. I'm not here for a girl, Maribel said from behind a veil. Her voice was soft but steady. I'm here for a man. For a moment the noise around them dimmed. Men who had been inspecting teeth and shoulders glanced over, openly curious. A widow buying a male slave was not unheard of. A widow like Maribel doing so publicly, however, was a different kind of spectacle. Coast cleared his throat. We have a strong lot of field hands coming up after the carriages. If you take a seat, I'm not here for a field hand either, she said. Her gloved fingers tightened on the velvet purse. I'm here for a particular man. His name is Lazarus. Cossey's eyes flickered. He had to school his expression carefully. Then, Lazarus was not the name printed on any of the public broadsheets tacked to posts outside the market. He was never paraded with the others, never placed on the outer platform at high noon. Lazarus was a name whispered inside rooms, a name written in margins, not ledgers, a name associated with a very particular kind of value that respectable people pretended they didn't know about. I'm afraid I don't know. Do not lie to me, Mr. Coast, Maribel said quietly. My husband dealt with you for years. I have seen his books. That was not strictly true. She had not seen Victor's main plantation ledgers while he was alive. He had kept those locked. She had, however, pried loose a board in his study wall after his death and discovered a second ledger, one that did not record cotton yields or barrel counts, but something far more obscene. There in her husband's tight, meticulous hand were names of men and women catalogued not just by their skills, but by their flesh. Hips wide enough to bear children, shoulders broad enough to father strong offspring, health and height and bone structure, all listed in a cold calculation of human breeding. There had been a list of men with a tiny letter beside each name. Breeder. Some were crossed out. A few had notes. Dull, waste seed. Unreliable. One name had no such edits, only the simple notation Victor reserved for something he considered rare and flawless. Lazarus 2000, proven do not lose. Coast studied her through narrowed eyes, weighing risk against profit. That ain't a name we use for public trade, he said slowly. I am not the public, she replied. And I have 2000 that says you do in fact have him. The word moved through the crowd like wind through reeds. 2000. Most men within earshot had never paid so much for a human soul in their lives. 2000 could buy an entire family, a dozen field hands, a small house in town. To offer it for a single man meant he was not being purchased merely to swing a hoe. Several faces turned openly now, curiosity sharpening into prurient interest. The virgin widow, they thought. So that is how she plans to solve her little problem. Coasty hesitated only a fraction of a heartbeat longer. Then he gestured to one of his runners. Fetch the special lot from the back, he muttered. The one in chain room 3. Tell him we got a buyer. The boy darted off. Ashford, Coast said, shifting his attention back to her. You understand the type of property you're asking for. These men ain't standard stock. Papers are sensitive. I understand perfectly. She lied. She understood a fraction of it, enough to burn. The money is in my carriage. Your man may count it there. I'll wait. She took a step back as the auctioneer called another lot. A woman with 2 small children was hauled up onto the block, her hair mussed, eyes wide. Bids began in someone's board drone. Maribel's stomach clenched. She turned away. She hadn't come to the market for the first 20 years of her life. Her father had traded tobacco and sugar, but the actual markets had been to her abstract places spoken of in account books, but not experienced in flesh. Victor had maintained that it was no sight for a lady. It was perhaps the only thing she had ever agreed with him about. Yet here she was, standing amid the cries and chains because of a ledger he had hidden from her and a secret she had discovered scrawled in code beside her own name. M. Untested, reserved for special breeding. Discuss with SG. The initials had sat like a brand on the page. She knew on sight who SG was. There was only one man with those initials who had slithered in and out of their lives with bankers' smiles and ledger ink on his fingers. Silas Glee of the New Orleans Mercantile Bank, her husband's favorite creditor and advisor. The sound of chains preceded him. When the runner came back, he carried a key ring and walked in front of a tall, shackled man flanked by 2 guards. Even before she could see his face clearly, Maribel saw how his shadow fell across the planks. broad shoulders straight back, not broken yet. The crowd's murmur rose another notch. Lazarus wore no shirt, just a rough pair of trousers tied at the waist with a frayed cord. The iron around his wrists caught the light, and so did the faint strands of scars that tracked his forearms like pale vines. He was not pretty in the delicate sense some women favored, but his features were carved with a stern symmetry that made it impossible not to look at him. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, too intent for someone who was supposed to be livestock. Maribel's breath hitched behind her veil. She had never seen him before, and yet she felt absurdly that she recognized him. Recognized the shape of him from the sketches in Victor's ledger, little pencil silhouettes marked with measurements, chest, height, weight, notes on his progeny. Brought as requested, Coast said. Lazarus, you'll see his papers match. The man's gaze found her in the crowd. It slid over the veil over the black dress, and then stilled. There was a flicker, confusion, curiosity, something like wary amusement, in his eyes, as if he had not expected the person who bought him for 2,000 to be small-framed and young. Her gloved hand clamped over her purse like a drowning woman gripping a plank of wood. He tipped his head barely, a kind of acknowledgement. Not deference, not exactly. Recognition that she, unlike most here, had called him by name. The guards brought him up to the small side platform rather than the main block. There would be no bidding. This was a private sale dressed in the thin costume of an auction. The price you mentioned, Coast said, his voice low now for her ears and a few interested ones nearby, is accurate for previous quotations. Given passage of time and current market, I'd say 2,000, and Maribel repeated. As agreed, counting out here would be unseemly. Your man may come to my carriage. Coast licked his lips. He had surely never imagined he would be bargaining decorum with a woman over the purchase of a breeder. Very well, he said. We'll need signatures. This property is registered under a special class. Special class. That was what they called men whose worth was measured not in their ability to plough fields, but in how many children they could generate with other people's wives. Maribel's fingers trembled beneath her gloves. She forced them still. When the transaction was done, the money counted and the paper signed, Lazarus was led to her carriage in a small procession of eyes and whispers. Mrs. Ashford, someone murmured as she passed. So that's how the virgin widow means to stop being a virgin. The remark rippled outward like an oil slick. She knew some of them would repeat it at suppers and card games for weeks. Let them, she thought. Let them think they know what this is. The truth was worse. As Lazarus ducked to step into the carriage, Maribel's pulse thudded in her throat. She had brought a second copy of Victor's secret ledger, its pages carefully transcribed in her own neat hand. It lay wrapped in cloth on the seat opposite her, its presence as heavy as the man now sitting 3 feet away. He took his place without speaking, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. Even sitting, he took up so much space the interior felt smaller, crowded by his sheer presence. He smelled of iron sweat and something faintly medicinal, as if someone had recently rubbed his shoulders with salve. The carriage jolted forward. For a time, neither of them spoke. The city's cobblestones gave way to packed dirt. Shouts and cries faded. The air grew cooler as they moved toward the countryside. You paid too much, Lazarus said at last, breaking the silence. His voice was low, roughened by disuse or smoke. There was no gratitude in it, but no defiance either, a stated fact. No man is worth that. Maribel drew in a breath. My husband seemed to think otherwise. His gaze flicked to her veil. Victor Ashford is dead. Yes, her hands curled on her lap. His debts are not. Something like a ghost of a smile touched Lazarus's mouth. Then we share a misfortune, mine. Your debts are coin. Mine are flesh. She lifted her chin, though he couldn't see her expression clearly. Lazarus. He looked at her properly now, curiosity sharpening. How many children, she asked, have you been forced to father? The question changed the air between them. His jaw tightened. The chain rasped lightly against his wrist as his hands clenched. You ask plain for a lady, he said. I've spent 2 months reading a book that burned the word breeder into my eyes, she answered. Plain is all that's left to me. He watched her for a long moment, as if searching for mockery. Finding none, he turned his gaze to the small carriage window, watching the cypress trees slide past. I don't know the number, he said finally. Sometimes they told me, sometimes they didn't. Dozens, maybe more. Why? She swallowed. Because, Maribel said quietly, my husband had a plan to make me part of that number. And I don't know why he stopped. Outside, a flock of birds startled from a bare tree, black shapes scattering against a low grey sky. Inside, in the cramped space that smelled of leather and fear, the man called Lazarus shifted his gaze back to the woman who had bought him for 2,000. For the first time, something like interest, not the wary calculation of survival, but genuine interest lit his eyes. What do you want from me, Mrs. Ashford? He asked. My body or my memory? Her throat worked. Both, perhaps, she said, but not in the way you think. The carriage bumped over a rut. She steadied herself with a hand on the seat, then drew in a breath and let the veil of her habitual reserve slip for a heartbeat. If you're listening to this story right now, she whispered in her mind to some unseen audience, I wonder, what would you do in my place? Would you use a man like this to save everything you own, or burn the whole system down and lose it all? If the listener could have answered, their voices would have filled the carriage. Instead, there was only the creak of wheels and the faint rattle of chains, and somewhere inside her, a question that would not let go. If you were in Maribel's position, would you keep the ledger secret or expose it, even if it meant losing everything? Tell me in the comments what choice you think you'd make and why. Your answer will say more about you than you think. Ashford Reach emerged from the mist like something half-remembered from a fever dream. The big house sat on a low rise overlooking sugarcane fields gone dull for the season, its columns stained grey by years of weather. Live oaks draped in moss lined the road, their roots coiled like old bones. Smoke from the quarters chimneys drifted upward in thin, resigned trails. Servants and enslaved workers watched as the carriage rolled into the yard. The sight of chains glinting on the man inside drew stares, widened eyes murmured questions that skittered through the air like dry leaves. Miss Maribel's brought back a bull, someone whispered. Look at the size of him. She's really going to do it. Another muttered, Lord have mercy. The butler, an older free black man named Jonah, whose loyalty had always seemed more to the house than the man who owned it, stepped forward. His gaze flicked from Maribel's veiled face to Lazarus's shackled wrists and back. His lips thinned. He said nothing. Please see that he's quartered in the north outbuilding, Maribel said, stepping down from the carriage, away from the fields for now. I'll speak with him later. Yes, ma'am, Jonah said. His voice was carefully neutral. Two men moved to take Lazarus's chains. He allowed himself to be led from the carriage, his posture neither submissive nor challenging, merely controlled. As he passed Jonah, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Something unspoken flickered there, recognition of a kind. A man Jonah had seen before, not just in strength, but in the way he moved, like someone who had learned where pain would come from and how to meet it. Maribel walked into the big house with the weight of new eyes on her back. The hall smelled as it always had, beeswax, old wood, a faint tang of cigars from Victor's study. His boots still sat by the door, polished and empty. The silence he'd left behind held a shape, as if he might step back into it any moment, smooth his hair, and ask why she looked so pale. She went straight to his old study. The board in the wall had been carefully replaced after she discovered the hidden ledger. She pried it loose again, her fingers finding the familiar notch. From the hollow she drew out the original book and laid it on the desk beside her copied version. The two ledgers sat there like twin hearts, one black and one grey, pulsing with secrets. On one page, Lazarus's name appeared again and again in careful script. Next to each entry, a brief note. March 1839, G Plantation, St. James Parish. Owner Barak's objective, strength and stock. Result, 1 boy, 1 girl, strong. July 1840, V Estate, Plaquemines. Owner Vale, objective, hair and wedlock. Result unknown. August 1841, private house. City. Owner SG, objective, personal. Result undisclosed. There were more. Places that formed a map in her mind when she closed her eyes. Each name, not just the location, but a family, a dinner table, a pew in church. Her own initials appeared on another page, as if Victor had once planned to add her to that list. M.A., untested, reserve. Arrange private consult with SG when terms favorable. The fact that it had never been followed by a date or a location both relieved and haunted her. Why had Victor stopped? Had he repented or been forestalled? Or had he simply planned to use her later? Had death not taken him first? The fire in the grate cracked softly. Somewhere outside, a crow cawed. Maribel rubbed her temples. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her, shadows lengthening. The weight of what she knew pressed against her ribs. A soft knock at the door pulled her back. Come, she said. Jonah stepped in, closing the door behind him. Pardon, ma'am, he said. I've seen to the new man. Put him where you ask. North outbuilding, old carriage house. Gave him water and a bite. Thought you should know the talk's spreading fast. When does talk not spread fast in this parish? She asked tiredly. This is different, Jonah said. His voice softened. They're saying you bought yourself a breeder, ma'am. Maribel's hands stiffened on the desk. And what do you say, Jonah? She asked quietly. He hesitated, eyes dropping to the ledger just long enough for her to realize he'd seen it before. Perhaps not that exact one, but something like it somewhere in some other man's study. I say there's things a woman does to survive a world made by men, he answered, and sometimes what looks like sin from the pews is just someone choosing between different kinds of hell. She stared at him. Will you judge me for what I do next? She asked. Jonah's gaze lifted back to her face, steady and sad. Not my place to judge, he said. But I'll tell you this. Whatever you do, make sure you own it. Don't let them pretend you were nothing but someone else's idea. After he left, Maribel sat a long time with that sentence. Don't let them pretend you were nothing but someone else's idea. The thought followed her when she finally left the study and made her way through the house, past portraits of Ashford's long dead, past doorways where she had once stood listening to Victor and Silas talk in low, conspiratorial tones. It followed her out the back door, across the yard toward the old carriage house where Lazarus waited. The north outbuilding had once housed fine carriages and riding tack. Now it held crates and broken chairs, dust layering everything in a quiet grey. Lazarus sat on an overturned crate near the back wall, chains removed, but a heavy iron shackle still fixed around one ankle, tethered by a long chain to a floor bolt. He looked up when she entered. Mrs. Ashford, he said. Not ma'am now, but the formality of someone acknowledging another as a person rather than a role. Lazarus. She closed the door behind her, cutting off the outside noise. The air in here was cooler, smelling of old leather and damp wood. Light from a small high window fell across his bare shoulders, tracing the lines of old scars. Are you comfortable? He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. I've known worse. You put me under a roof. That's more than some. She studied him. His posture was relaxed but not careless. His gaze was alert. There was no attempt to ingratiate himself, but no overt hostility either. He was too experienced for that, she realized. a man who had learned the uselessness of most reactions. She moved closer, the hem of her dress whispering over the floorboards. She had brought the copied ledger wrapped in cloth again under her arm. "I didn't bring you here for what they think," she said. "I know." He tilted his head, watching her. "Not yet, anyway." She flushed under her veil, then steadied herself. "I brought you here because my husband kept a book with your name in it. I think you may be the only person alive who can help me read it properly." He eyed the bundle in her hands. "Victor kept many books," Lazarus said. "The usual ones about who picked how much and who cost what." "You talking about a different kind?" "Yes," she said. "The kind men hide in their walls." Something moved in his expression. Recognition, yes, and anger, banked but not forgotten. "Bring it here," he said quietly. She unwrapped the ledger and handed it to him, careful not to let her hands brush his. It felt like handing a candle to someone sitting in a dry barn. A single spark in a world of tinder. He opened it slowly. For a long time Lazarus said nothing. His eyes moved across the pages with an intensity that swallowed the room. His fingertips hovered over names, dates, notes. Occasionally his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking near his temple. "You can read," she said softly. It was not truly a question. He snorted. "Men who trade in bodies sometimes forget we got minds too, but not always. Sometimes they teach us numbers and letters so we can tally their fortunes. Think it don't matter if we see what they're doing long as we can't do nothing about it." His finger landed on his own. "Here," he said. "That's me. That's G Plantation, St. James. That's Vale's place. That's SG. He used to come by Victor's office. Smelled like ink and citrus." "Silas Clay," she said. "My banker." "Makes sense," Lazarus muttered. He flipped another page. "This is quite the choir of righteous men you got scribbled here. Planters, judges, preachers. They all sang real pretty on Sundays." Maribel's throat tightened. "Tell me about them," she said. "Tell me what you remember. Every house, every face, every time they sent you into a room you did not choose." He looked up sharply. "Why?" he demanded. "So you can feel sorry for me, or so you can get what you paid for with less guilt?" "I bought you," she said, her voice shaking, "because my husband was planning to use you on me as he did on them. Because there is a note beside my name in that ledger, and I don't know why the plan stopped. Because the man who holds my debts is in that book too. And because I am tired of being the only one in this story who doesn't know what has been done to them." Something in her face must have stripped the words of their self-pity and left only the raw need beneath. Lazarus studied her for a long moment, the ledger balanced on his knee. "You think he stopped?" Lazarus asked quietly. "You think Victor repented?" "I don't know," she whispered. He let out a breath through his nose, something like a weary sigh. "I'll tell you what I know," he said. "Not because you own me, because I'm tired of being the only one who remembers." He began to talk. The words came slowly at first, each one dragged from a place he had learned to nail shut. He spoke of hot nights and cold rooms, of long rides into the country with a bag over his head, of being taken into parlors and bedrooms as if he were a tool taken from a locked trunk. He did not describe the acts in detail. He did not need to. The violence of it all lay in the structure, not the motion, in the way men with names carved into courthouse pedestals sat in studies and discussed breeding strategies over brandy, talking about skull shapes and bloodlines while wives wept quietly in upstairs rooms. He spoke of one place where a gentleman had refused to even look at him, delegating all instructions through a steward, as if physical acknowledgement might taint him. Of another where a woman had clutched his arm and whispered apologies into his shoulder as though any apology could reach where the harm was done. Maribel's hands tightened in her lap until her nails bit her palms. Her vision blurred. She listened anyway. He spoke of the Vale estate, where a child with pale eyes and hair the color of his own had run past his legs without knowing to whom his height and strength were owed. Of Silas Glazed townhouse, where a thin woman with bruises on her wrists had watched from a doorway, her gaze hollow as if she had already vanished from her own life. When he finished, the silences between his words echoed louder than anything he'd said. Maribel stared at the ledger, its neat columns now smeared by the human weight Lazarus's voice had given them. "And my husband," she whispered. "What did he?" Lazarus's mouth tightened. "Victor liked to think of himself as the man who kept the wheel graced," he said. "He didn't always participate, leastways not that I saw. He liked to talk about theory, bloodlines and such. He liked to profit from it. He liked to be important. Once I heard him say to another man, 'We're making a better South, one improved generation at a time.' The word struck her like a blow. Once, Victor had said something similar at dinner about crop rotation, a better South through better soil. Now she knew he had meant both. "Did he ever speak of me?" she asked. "Did he ever mention?" Lazarus hesitated. "One time," he said slowly. "They were in his study. Glay was there. Victor said something about wasted wom, said it was a pity to have a young wife with good hips and no issue. Glay said that was a problem he could help solve. They talked about arrangements, about me, about a certain sum. Your name was mentioned. Then later I heard Glay say the deal was postponed. Didn't say why." Her skin crawled with every word. The study they spoke of was the one she now stood in whenever she opened the hidden compartment. The desk they had leaned on was the one where she had written letters of condolence to men whose wives had died in childbirth. She felt suddenly that she had been a ghost in her own marriage, walking past closed doors that held the architecture of her life. "Postponed," she repeated. "Not cancelled." "So it seemed," Lazarus said. She pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. So I am here, she said hoarsely, with a dead husband's ledger, a banker who holds my land in his fist, and a man whose name appears beside half the children in this region with strong jawlines. Tell me, Lazarus, what do I do with this? He looked at her a long time. Most folks who know a little like this keep quiet, he said. Protect what's theirs. Some try to use it for blackmail. Most end up dead or worse. And you, she asked. What do you want? He gave a short, humorless laugh. Want, he said. I stopped using that word a long time ago, Mrs. Ashford. What I need is simpler. I need not to be sold again. I need to see the men who used me look afraid for once. I need the children they made me bring into this world not to grow up in the same lie. That's all. She thought of the boy at the Budrocks plantation with Lazarus's eyes, of the preacher's daughter whose cheekbones mirrored his, of the note beside her own name. I can't promise I'll save everyone, she said softly. I may not be able to save myself. Maybe not, Lazarus said. But you got something I don't, a name they still have to respect in daylight, a seat they still leave for you at table. You can walk into rooms I can't. They taught you to stitch and smile. Maybe it's time you cut something open instead. She let out a shaky breath. Do you trust me? She asked. No, he said simply. But I trust that you hate being used. That's a start. Days turned into weeks at Ashford Reach, each one stretching and contracting around the secret that lived in the carriage house and the ledger that lay in Victor's old study. To the outside world, little seemed changed. The cane fields were pruned and burned. The enslaved workers went about their tasks under the overseer's watchful eye. The house hosted the occasional dinner for neighboring planters, though the gatherings were muted now, draped in the respectable sadness of mourning. But under that surface, patterns shifted. Maribel began to call Lazarus to the house at odd hours, not to her bedroom, as gossip assumed, but to the study. Jonah would bring him by side corridors at dusk, when the overseer was at supper and Silas was not present. There, under lamplight, she would spread the ledger open, and they would trace routes across the parish with their fingers. They built a map together. Here was Beaujerox's place, where a girl with Lazarus's eyes had been born into a family that would never admit her blood. Here was the Vale estate, where a widow ruled quietly over a house full of children who resembled no portrait on the wall. Here was Glee's townhouse, whose servants gossiped in the markets about odd visitors at late hours. Sometimes Lazarus would fall silent mid-sentence, his gaze going distant as a memory gripped him. Maribel learned not to press him then. She would talk instead of what she knew best: debts, interest, how bankers turned land and lives into numbers on a page. It was a different kind of enslavement, but a chain all the same. Silas has my father's old tobacco farm and my husband's holdings tied up in notes I can barely untangle, she confessed one evening. He always explained it as a kindness. Helping a lady manage complicated affairs, he said. Lazarus tapped the ledger with one finger. A man who sits in both these books, he said, don't do nothing from kindness. Winter deepened. The first Sunday of Advent brought people to church in black coats and stiff collars, the pews filled with the rustle of skirts and the creak of wooden benches. Out in the yard, enslaved families huddled in their own separate congregation, listening through open windows. The sermon that day was on righteousness and the perils of fleshly temptation. The preacher spoke with fervor about chastity, about the honor of widows who resisted unholy users of their bodies. He looked straight at Maribel as he said it. A dozen pairs of eyes followed his gaze. She sat very still, the hidden ledger like a stone at the base of her spine. The knowledge it contained made every word in the preacher's mouth ring hollow. His eldest son sat 2 pews down. The boy's jawline was a familiar echo of another man's face. When the collection plate came, she placed her coin upon it and thought of how many sermons had been purchased with silence. After the service, in the icy brightness of the churchyard, Silas Glee approached her. He wore black gloves and a smile that never truly reached his eyes. Mrs. Ashford, he said, inclining his head, you are a picture of devotion this morning. I'll confess, when I heard you had gone to the slave market alone, I wondered if it might be the beginning of decline. His gaze flicked briefly toward the cluster of men whispering nearby. I see now that you remain as proper as ever. Appearances, she said, can be deceptive. His smile sharpened. Indeed, which is why we must be careful what appearances we create. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You have taken on a considerable piece of property, he said. That man co-sold you is known in certain circles. Word has reached my ears as I suspect it has others. A young widow purchasing such a special investment. He let the sentence trail off suggestively. You must see how that looks. She fought the urge to flinch. I see that it is my business whom I purchase, she replied. My husband left me in charge of Ashford Reach. If I wish to buy a mule or a man, that is my prerogative, is it not? Up to a point, Silas said pleasantly. But there are contracts, you see, obligations. The bank has a vested interest in ensuring that its collateral is maintained with the utmost respectability. The word settled between them like a bad smell. Are you threatening me, Mr. Gley? She asked. Merely advising you. He gave that small patronizing chuckle she loathed. You are young and inexperienced in certain matters. It would be a shame for gossip to lead to questions about your management, questions that might compel the bank to take a more active role in stewardship. Stewardship? She repeated coldly. Is that what you call it? When a man chokes a thing so tightly in his fist it can barely breathe. His eyes chilled. For a moment the genial mask slipped. You should have remarried by now, Mrs. Ashford, he said quietly. A woman in your position needs a husband to bear certain responsibilities. I have made recommendations. Recommendations I ignored, she said. Perhaps I'll continue to do so. He dipped his head in a gesture that looked like submission but felt like a threat. We'll speak again soon, he said, about your accounts. As he walked away, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Whitfield, sidled up with a pitying smile. My dear, she cooed, you must be so lonely out there at Ashford Reach. If you ever feel tempted by the devil, remember that your body is a temple. The Lord will send you strength. Maribel looked past her at the woman's eldest daughter, standing in the sun with light hair and wide shoulders, and a slightly crooked smile she had seen once before on a ledger page. The Lord, Maribel said, seems to send different kinds of strength to different people, Mrs. Whitfield. She turned away before the woman could respond. That night, back in the carriage house, she told Lazarus about both conversations. They're closing ranks, he said. They smell something they don't like. What do they think I'll do? She asked. Parade you through town with a banner reading, Here is the man who fathered half your hairs. He shrugged. A secret's only comfortable when it's in the hands of the right people. You're the wrong people now. You weren't supposed to see that book. She paced the narrow strip of floor, her skirts swishing around her ankles. The single lamp cast their shadows large on the back wall, hers thin and straight, his broad. If I do nothing, Silas takes the land eventually, she said. He tightens the debt until I drown. If I marry some man of his choosing, I become a broodmare on a different farm. If I use you the way they used you elsewhere. She trailed off, bile rising in her throat. Then I become exactly what they built me to be when they wrote my initials in that ledger. Someone else's idea. Lazarus watched her. There's another way, he said. Harder, messier, dangerous. Say it, she whispered. We make them afraid, he said. Not with guns, with truth. It sounded grand and foolish at once. Truth never protected anyone in this parish, she said bitterly. Maybe not yet, he said. But that's because it's always spoken from mouths nobody has to listen to. Housegirls whispering in kitchens. Men like me talking to each other in chains. You got the ledger. You got the name. You sit at their table. What if you didn't talk about debts and weather next time? What if you talked about this? The idea made her stomach turn. To sit in a parlour with Augusta Vale and Silas and the Whitfields and calmly mention that she knew which of their children bore Lazarus's blood. It was madness. Even if I did, she said, what leverage do I truly have? They would deny everything, burn the ledger, silence you. Not if they knew there was more than one book, he said, more than one witness. Not if they thought the story could travel farther than their reach, she frowned. What do you mean? Lazarus leaned forward, chains clinking softly at his ankle. You ever heard of abolitionist papers, Mrs. Ashford? He asked. Writers up north who pay good money for stories that make southern men look like the devils they are. She had heard of them, vaguely. Pamphlets smuggled in bales of cotton, speeches read in secret, dangerous literature that if found could get a woman whipped or a man killed. There's a boy down at the river, Lazarus continued, works unloading crates. He used to run messages for a printer in the city. Knows how to get letters on boats that ain't checked too close. He owes me a favor. He held her gaze. A story with names and dates and numbers, written by a white widow whose husband was one of them, signed in her fine hand. That carries weight, ma'am. Enough to make a man like Glee think twice about squeezing you too hard. The thought of her name printed in some northern paper, her words dissecting the world she lived in. It was dizzying. They'd hang me for that, she said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe they'd be so scared of the rope they'd choose a quieter way. Settle your debts, cut you loose to some small farm, let you slip away so long as you keep your mouth shut. And you, she asked. What happens to you in this plan? He shrugged one shoulder. Maybe I end up in chains on some road gang till my legs give out. Maybe I run. Maybe I don't live long at all. But at least I die having done something other than what they trained me for. Silence stretched between them. If you're still with me this far into this story, a part of Maribel thought toward that invisible listener again. Tell me, would you risk your safety to shatter a system like this? Or would you protect yourself and stay quiet? There's no easy right answer, no matter how loud your heart shouts one. She looked at Lazarus. His eyes were steady, waiting. I'll need names, she said. All of them, and I'll need proof beyond this ledger. Letters, witnesses, anything we can gather. His mouth quirked. Then we better get to work. The weeks that followed were a slow, secret revolution. Maribel began to accept invitations she had previously declined. Afternoons at Augusta Vale's dining room table, evening suppers at the Whitfield parsonage, sudden, calculated visits to Silas's office under the pretense of discussing refinancing schedules. She went with a new gaze. Children who had once been a blur of curls and pinafores now stood out in sharp detail. The set of a boy's shoulders, the curve of a girl's jaw, the way a teenager's laugh sounded eerily like Lazarus's when something truly amused him. She could not unsee it. In drawing rooms, she listened. Women loosened by sherry spoke half in code about late blessings and unexpected answers to prayer, about husbands who had been ill or tired during the years their sons were conceived. Men, confident in her silence, joked about foreign blood strengthening old stock in ways they believed she was too naive to catch. She tucked every remark away. Sometimes when conversation dipped, she would let her gaze linger a heartbeat too long on a child's face. Once at the Vale estate, she remarked lightly that young Thomas had grown so tall, almost as tall as that strong man who once worked your fields, Mrs. Vale. What was his name? The one Mr. Ashford spoke of so often. Augusta's hand tightened on her wine glass. We've had many workers over the years, she said sharply. And my son's lineage is unquestionable. Maribel smiled with empty politeness. Of course, that night, Lazarus confirmed her suspicion. Vale's boy, he said. I remember her, she cried afterwards. Said her husband had given her no choice. Said she'd tell herself it was God's will if the baby came healthy. Guess she convinced herself. The more they talked, the more the map in the ledger filled with stories rather than numbers. Each entry sprouted faces, voices, tears. You know, Lazarus said once, some of them weren't cruel. Not to me, anyway. Some tried to be kind in their own twisted way. Gave me extra food, spoke soft, but kindness wrapped around a crime is still a crime. Do you hate them? She asked. He stared at the lamp flame. I hate what they did more than who they were, he said. But I don't think that makes much difference to the children they made. Spring crept up quietly, bud by bud, on the bare branches. Cane was planted. The fields stirred with new growth, so did rumors. Word spread that Mrs. Ashford was receiving more visitors than before, that she walked the rows of her own fields asking questions about yields and weather patterns in a way Victor never had, that she had been seen speaking privately with Jonah, with the midwife from the quarters, with a boy down at the docks. Silas grew increasingly pointed in his conversations. You're overstepping, he said one afternoon in his office, where sunlight slanted through tall windows onto stacks of ledgers. A woman meddling in such matters will only bring disaster. She scanned the columns of numbers representing Ashford Reach. You speak of disaster as if it weren't already baked into these accounts, she said. Tell me, Mr. Glay, how many of these notes belong to men also listed in this ledger? She slid Victor's book from her reticule and laid it on his desk. His face changed. For a man as practiced as Silas, the loss of composure lasted only a second, but it was enough. His eyes widened, his skin paled under its city tan, and his hand shot out as if to slam the book shut. Where did you get that? He hissed. From my husband's walls, she said calmly. Where he hid it instead of putting it in your bank vault. I wonder why. You don't understand what you're playing with, Silas said. That book contains private information. It contains an accounting of how men like you and my husband treated human beings as livestock, she said, and how you nested that cruelty inside marriages, POWs, and laws. The question is not whether I understand it. The question is whether I'm willing to stay quiet. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. You're not the only widow in this parish, he said. You think you can stand against the combined weight of every name in that book. You'd be crushed before you finished your first righteous sentence. Perhaps, she said. Perhaps not. There are people up north who might find these names interesting. His breath caught. Abolitionist filth, he spat. Traitors, fanatics, you would align yourself with them. I would align myself with whatever force gives me leverage against men who wrote my WOM into a breeding plan, she said, her voice shaking with fury. Do not talk to me of traitors. Silas stared at her, chest heaving. You'd be ruined, he said. They'd call you whore and madwoman. No respectable man would touch you. She smiled thinly. You and your friends already whisper that in corners, don't you? It's remarkable how little that threat frightens me now. He leaned across the desk, putting his face close to hers. What do you want? He demanded. Name it. There must be something. She held his gaze. I want Ashford Reach free of your hands, she said. My debts cleared or reduced to something I can pay within my lifetime. I want the note on the tobacco farm released. I want legal manumission papers drawn up for certain names. I will give you Lazarus among them. And I want you to know every day you breathe from this moment on that, if anything happens to me or to him, copies of this ledger and letters bearing your name will travel north within the week. His face blanched. You overestimate your power, he said. And you overestimate my fear, she replied. She left his office with her heart beating like a drum and her hands trembling so badly she had to pause in a quiet alley to compose herself. By the time she reached the carriage, she had wrapped herself back in calm. That evening in the carriage house, she relayed the conversation to Lazarus. You stared down the man who owns your paper life, he said, a flicker of admiration in his voice. How's it feel? Terrifying, she said, then laughed unexpectedly. And a little like being alive for the first time. He smiled just a little. It changed his face, softening the heaviness around his eyes. You know he won't keep his word easy, Lazarus said. Men like that look for ways around promises, loopholes. I know, she said. That's why we make sure he understands what happens if he tries. They worked late into the night drafting letters. One for a printer in New York Lazarus had heard of, passed along in whispers. One addressed vaguely to friends of the cause at an abolitionist society. She wrote in her neat hand, telling a story that began with a hidden ledger and a purchase at a New Orleans market and ended with a woman who refused to live out a script written for her by men who thought of her as an entry on a breeding chart. She did not name every name. Not yet. But she named enough. Copies of the letters were tucked into hollow nooks in the house and under a loose board in the carriage house. One sealed envelope was entrusted to Jonah with no explanation, only a request. If something should happen to me, she said, if you hear I've been taken ill suddenly or sent away, this goes to the river. You find the boy Lazarus spoke of. You make sure it leaves. Jonah looked at her, eyes long used to loss in calculation. You set a fire you might not be able to put out, Miss Marable, he said softly. I'm sitting in one already, she replied. I'm just deciding who burns. The day the reckoning came, it wore its Sunday coat. Marable received an invitation written in Augusta's elegant hand. A gathering of concerned friends, it said, to discuss certain matters of propriety and future security. The time was set for late afternoon. The place Augusta's drawing room. She knew before she stepped into the carriage that she was walking into a trial. She dressed accordingly, in her plainest black gown, the one least flattering to her figure. She wanted no hint of the seductress about her. Let them look at her and see a widow with a ledger, not a woman with a secret lover in the carriage house. Lazarus watched her button her gloves with steady fingers. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I'm going anyway. If they hurt you," he said quietly, "I won't sit chained and wait." She met his gaze. "If they hurt me," she said, "the letters go out, and this whole parish will learn what it means to use a man like you as a tool and then leave him in the shed when the work is done." He nodded once. Augusta's drawing room was a study in controlled wealth. Velvet drapes, heavy carved chairs, paintings of ancestors who had never lifted anything heavier than a spoon. The air smelled of tea and brandy and something acid beneath. Fierce Silas was there, of course. So were the Whitfields and 3 other planters whose names appeared in Victor's ledger, each with multiple entries. Their wives sat beside them, composed masks over eyes that betrayed more knowledge than they would ever admit. "Mrs. Ashford," Augusta said as Maribel entered, her tone cordial but cool. "Thank you for coming." "It seemed wise," Maribel said, taking the empty seat they had clearly designated for her in the center of the semicircle. "It is rarely good to ignore a summons from one's betters." A small ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Silas cleared his throat. "We are here," he said, "because there has been talk, disturbing talk about ledgers that should not exist, about letters that might soon leave our fair city containing false and damaging claims. We thought it best to address these matters within the family, so to speak." "False," she repeated, letting the word taste bitter on her tongue. "Is that today's choice of lie?" "Mrs. Ashford," the preacher said, folding his hands. "You have always been a woman of good character. We wish to believe that you have been misled, that grief and isolation have confused your judgment." "You mean you hope I've lost my mind?" she said, "because a mad woman's words carry less weight than a sane one's." "Your behavior with that man you purchased is concerning," Augusta said tightly. "A widow receiving a male slave alone in her study at all hours. The optics, my dear. The danger to your reputation, to all our reputations." Maribel let her gaze travel slowly around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "My reputation," she said, "concerns you now after you wrote my wom into your breeding plans." Gasps fluttered through the room like startled birds. "Victor's ledger is full of your names," she continued, her voice low but carrying. "It lists the nights you invited men like Lazarus into your homes, the reason you keep certain boys close and others in the fields, the arrangements you made when your husbands could not do what you required of them. That book is not madness, it is arithmetic." "Those were private matters," one of the planters snapped. "Family issues. We did what was necessary to secure our lines. By turning one man into a tool you passed around like a shared horse," she said. "By treating your wives' bodies as vessels for your pride and your fear. Do not wrap it in the language of necessity, call it what it is." Silas's face had grown steadily redder enough. He said sharply, "This is precisely why such books should not be in women's hands." "You lack context. You lack context," she interrupted. "You mean the context where you profit from every transaction? Where you hold the notes on the land those improved heirs will inherit? Where you sit in your bank and count the interest on secrets?" His mouth snapped shut. The preacher's wife, pale but composed, spoke then. "Even if some indiscretions occurred," she said, "they were done within marriage, within the bounds of covenant." "You would tear apart families, Mrs. Ashford, for the sake of what? Vengeance?" "I would tear apart a lie," Maribel said. "What comes after is up to you." "Your position is precarious," one of the other men said. "Your debts, your lack of protectors. It would be a simple thing to deem you unfit to manage your estate, to place Ashford Reach under trusteeship for your own good." "And appoint whom?" she asked. "Mr. Gley, one of you, so you may tuck the ledger into a fire and erase the record of what you've done." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded paper. "You underestimate me. Copies exist. Letters already written. You can burn this house down over my head, and it won't change that." Silas surged to his feet. "You stupid girl," he snarled before catching himself, glancing at the others. You overstate your reach. Northerners don't care about nuanced truths. They'll paint us all as monsters." "Then perhaps you should have acted less monstrously," she said. The room went very still. Augusta's hand shook openly now where it rested on her lap. "What do you want?" she whispered, echoing Silas's earlier question. Maribel looked at her, at the lines etched around her mouth from years of holding in her own secrets. "I want choices," she said quietly. "For myself, for the people you've used. I want Lazarus freed in law as well as in fact. I want your debts to my husband's bank reconciled without the noose of interest around my throat. I want you to know that your children walk on soil soaked in the truth of their making, whether you speak it aloud or not." "And if we refuse?" one man asked. She unfolded the paper in her hand. It bore only a few lines of neat script, but the names on it made several faces blanch. "Then the names on this list will appear in a paper printed hundreds of miles from here, accompanied by excerpts from Victor's ledger," she said. "And you will spend the rest of your days watching every stranger who arrives at your gate, wondering if they've read them." Silas licked his lips. "You would destroy us all to save yourself?" he asked. "No," she said. "I would give you the chance to choose what kind of ruin you can live with." A long silence followed. In that quiet, something cracked. It was not as dramatic as a shouted confession or a sudden collapse. It was more like the slow splitting of river ice under spring sun. Eyes shifted. A woman's hand slid from her husband's arm. Someone exhaled shakily. Augusta Vale spoke first. "I will sign whatever papers you require for that man's freedom," she said, voice rough. "And I will speak to others. You know as well as I do, Silas, that we've leaned on certain services. We all carry some part of this stain." The preacher's wife flinched. Her gaze darted to her eldest son, who stood in the doorway listening, his brow furrowed. She shut her eyes. "Do it," she whispered to her husband, "before the Lord decides to do it for us." Reluctantly, grudgingly, the tide shifted. It was not a total victory. Men bargained even now, seeking to minimize losses, to draw lines around what would be acknowledged and what would be buried. But a path opened. In the days that followed, documents were drafted behind closed doors. Silas, face like carved stone, drew up fresh terms on the Ashford debts. Interest lowered, timelines extended, certain liens quietly released. A manumission paper bearing Lazarus's name was signed by 3 reluctant hands. "It ain't freedom if they sign it with a pistol at their back," Lazarus said when Jonah brought the paper to the carriage house. "But I'll take it over iron any day." He held the document like something fragile and unreal, reading his own name in cold ink. "So that's it," he said softly. "A few strokes of a pen and I'm suddenly not property." "On paper," Maribel said. "In their hearts, I suspect they'll never see you as anything else." He looked at her. "And you?" he asked. "I don't know what I see you as yet," she said. "But it's not cattle. And it's not a stud in a ledger." He laughed, a real laugh this time. It startled them both. "Well," he asked, "you stay here and oversee crops. I go where? North? West?" She had thought of that. She had thought of him on a road in some other place, carrying his scars and memories into a world that might still try to own him in different ways. She had also thought of him staying, his presence a constant reminder to the parish of what they had done. "I can't decide that for you," she said. "You've had enough of other people choosing your fate." He looked at the manumission paper again, then at her, then around the dim carriage house that had become, improbably, a kind of confessional. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. "Selling what you can, taking the rest in coin, finding some little house in a place nobody knows the name Ashford." She had. Late at night, when the weight of stares and expectations pressed too hard, she had imagined herself in a small town somewhere without plantations, where a widow could be just a woman who baked bread and mended dresses. She had imagined a life where her one was not a line item. "I've thought about it," she said. "But I look at these fields and these people, and I know what kind of man will buy this place if I sell. Someone who never saw that ledger or pretended it didn't exist. Someone who will turn everything back to how it was, or worse. If I stay, maybe I can bend things a little." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe I stay too," he said. "For a while. Long enough to see if the bend holds. People will talk," she warned. "They already do. A freed man living on a white widow's land. They'll make us into a story they can swallow, not the one we're actually living. They've been doing that my whole life," he said dryly. "This time, maybe we write a line or two ourselves." Spring rolled into summer. The cane grew tall and green. Life at Ashford Reach did not become a utopia. Men still yelled. Whips still cracked sometimes, though less often under Jonah's watchful eye. The world did not change overnight because of one ledger and a handful of signatures. But some things shifted. Maribel altered work schedules, moved families closer together, quietly banned the sale of children under her immediate authority. When other planters commented, she shrugged and said it made economic sense. Healthy, stable workers were better workers. Let them hear the language they understood while she did what she could in the margins. Lazarus took on work that kept him in between spaces, supervising repairs, overseeing shipments, roles that did not fit neatly into anyone's old categories. Some whites grumbled about uppity freed men. Some enslaved folk looked at him with suspicion, unsure if he was ally or spy. He bore it with the same quiet he'd borne everything else. But now there was a difference. When he walked past the fields, men did not look away as quickly. Children sometimes straightened, as if seeing a possibility they had not known existed. At night, sometimes he and Maribel would sit on the back porch in the thick, buzzing warmth, a respectful distance between their chairs. They would talk of small things then, weather, stories from his childhood, memories of her mother's garden before her father's debts swallowed it. Once, when a storm rolled in, lightning flickering on the horizon, she asked him a question that had been gnawing at her. "Do you ever wish," she said, "that I had never found that ledger?" He thought for a long time. "If you hadn't," he said slowly, "I'd probably be on some other man's land right now, doing what I was bought to do. My back would ache, my hands would hurt, and I'd be counting the days till they put me in the ground." He glanced at her. "You'd be sitting in this house listening to Silas tell you what's for your own good. You'd still be the virgin widow in their minds, whether it was true or not. Maybe you'd have a child by some man chosen for you. Maybe not. But either way, you wouldn't know why your life felt so small." He shrugged. "I don't know if what we got now is better," he said. "It's harder. It hurts in different ways. But at least when I look at a thing, I know what it is. There's power in that. Even if it can't save us from everything." She nodded slowly. "If you're hearing this part of the story," she thought to that invisible listener once more, "maybe you understand. Not all victories look like flags and fireworks. Sometimes they look like two people sitting on a porch in the dark, trying to make sense of a world that was never built for them to be anything but tools." The summer wore on. There were losses. A boy in the fields was beaten by a neighboring overseer during a cooperative harvest, and though Maribel argued and threatened, she could not undo the damage. An older woman in the quarters died in childbirth, her body too worn by previous births demanded by masters. The ledger's scars were deeper than any one woman's will. There were small gains. A girl who had been slated for sale was quietly kept back, her price paid out of a hidden stash of coin Maribel scraped together by selling jewelry Silas had always admired. A family that had been split years before was partially reunited when Lazarus used his new, fragile influence to redirect a purchase. On Sundays, the preacher's sermons grew oddly vague. He spoke less about chastity and more about mercy. His eldest son, the one with Lazarus's jaw, began to stand in the back of the yard with the enslaved families instead of in front with the whites. No one dragged him forward. Rumors continued, of course. They always would. People said the virgin widow was not such a virgin anymore, though none could quite agree on details. Some whispered that she lay with a freed man in the fields under moonlight. Others said she had taken a lover in New Orleans, a mysterious printer who sent her radical books. She did not bother to correct them. Let them weave their tales. The truth of what she and Lazarus were to each other did not fit neatly into any of their categories. They were not lovers in the way people meant when they winked. They shared no bed. But they had done something more dangerous. They had shared knowledge and acted on it. One sticky night, when the air was thick as syrup, a storm finally broke over Ashford Reach. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Thunder shook the windows. In the carriage house, a loose board in the ceiling gave way. Water poured in, splattering across crates and that old floor bolt where Lazarus's chain had once been fixed. The iron ring, long unused, rusted and fragile, tore free from the rotten wood and clanged to the floor. Lazarus picked it up the next morning, turning it over in his hands. "Guess time's doing its own work too," he said. Maribel held the broken ring for a moment before setting it on a shelf in Victor's old study beside the ledger. A reminder, she thought, that even the strongest bolts rust in the end, that no chain lasts forever, that there is more than one way for a system to rot. She did not fool herself. The world outside her plantation lines was still cruel, still hungry. Men like Silas still wrote contracts in ink that might as well be blood. Children born of secrets still walked paths laid out for them by others. But somewhere in a printer shop far to the north, a story with her name on it had begun to circulate. She knew this not because she had seen it, though one day a folded paper would make its way back via clandestine route, bearing her words transformed by typesetters, but because she felt its presence like a distant storm. Letters came occasionally from unknown hands addressed to the widow who spoke. Some were clumsy, some eloquent. All of them proved that her actions had rippled beyond the cane fields. One evening, as the cicada screamed and fireflies blinked over the darkening rows, she stood at the edge of the field with Lazarus. "What's the worst thing that could still happen?" she asked him suddenly. He considered. "They could change their minds," he said. "Try to take back what they signed. You could get sick and die before you finish what you started. War could come. Or nothing could happen at all. No big wave. Just the slow same old swallowing everything we've done. And the best?" she asked. He looked at her, the red gold of sunset catching the edges of his scars. "The best," he said. "Maybe some boy who never knew his father's name grows up and reads about a man like him in a paper and realizes he's not some accident to be ashamed of, but proof that even systems built on lies can't control everything. Maybe some woman in a house like this one looks at her husband's locked desk and thinks, what if I opened it? Maybe we die and nothing much has changed, but we die knowing we weren't just ideas in other people's heads." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like a kind of freedom," she said. "Maybe that's all freedom is," he replied. "A say in your own story." Crickets chirped. The sky faded from gold to purple to black. If this story stayed with you, that quiet inner voice wanted to ask the listener now. If any part of Maribel or Lazarus felt too real to ignore, don't let it stop at your ears. Share it, talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that dig under the pretty paint of history and show you the rot and the fragile beauty underneath, make sure you're subscribed. Tap the like button and leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest and why. That's how you and I keep these ghosts talking instead of letting them be buried again. The next morning, Maribel rose before dawn. She walked through the quiet house, past portraits that now looked less like authority and more like accusation. In Victor's study, she paused by the shelf where the ledger and the broken iron ring sat side by side. She touched neither. Instead, she opened the window. Cool air flowed in, smelling of damp earth and possibility. Outside, the first light of day touched the cane fields, gilding each blade. Somewhere near the north outbuilding, Lazarus's low voice drifted up as he spoke to Jonah, planning the day's work. She stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under her bare feet. The world was still cruel, still unjust, but it was also, in this small space she occupied, altered. The virgin widow who had walked into the New Orleans slave market with a veil and a purse was not the same woman who stood here now with ink on her fingers and smoke of burned illusions in her lungs. She was something new, something unfinished, something that frightened the people who had written her into a ledger as if she were a horse. She smiled just a little at the thought. Then Maribel Ashford went down the steps to meet the day, the echo of chains and the scratch of pen strokes following her like ghosts, and just maybe like a chorus of witnesses refusing for once to be silent.